Hello, and welcome to our seminar discussion. I'm not sure how we actually describe it, to be honest, entitled Debunking Stereotypes, Diversity in Photographing Religion. And it's being presented this evening, I'm sure you know, by the Religion Media Centre. And you can find out all about the Religion Media Centre at religionmediacentre.org.uk. Or if you want to follow us on Twitter, that's at RelMed Centre, at RelMed Centre. If you're not aware of what we do, we're here to promote religious literacy, especially for journalists. And we present all kinds of Zooms like this one. And we also produce a daily email, which on the website you can subscribe to. Very, very useful every single day. Stories about faith groups, minority groups, all kinds of stories to do with religion that you can get every single day into your inbox. So as I say, tonight's discussion is about debunking the stereotypes, diversity in photographing religion. How should journalists in particular represent accurately and sensitively the diversity of faith expression when covering religious stories and faith communities? How often, this is a real question, how often do we resort to easy and lazy stock images when writing about religion? How often do we condense the complexity of a particular faith group into one stereotypical photograph that we think naively sums up the spectrum of belief or tradition within that particular faith group? So in this session, we'll discuss how photos of religious minorities are used in the media appropriately or otherwise, we'll discover. And to do that discussion this evening, we've got some very, very interesting speakers who've researched this area, published in this area, or indeed struggle themselves with the dilemma of photographic portrayal of religious minorities in news stories. We've got Rob Stothard, who is an award-winning, multi-award-winning photography artist, journalist, and educator based in London. His work's been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Times, Vanity Fair, and many, many more publications as well. He's a 2 times winner of the Magenta Foundation Flash Forward Award, the Times Canon Young Photographer of the Year Award. I'm sure Rob will tell me I'm getting these wrong. And the Magnum Photos 30 Under 30 Award. And he's also got an MA, master's degree in documentary photography and photojournalism from the London College of Communication. Also, we've got Dr Keith Kahn Harris, who's a sociologist and a writer based in London, and the co-author and author of several books, at least 8 books, and the editor of several collections and many articles and reviews. And his career bridges so many different things, especially academia and multiple other worlds. So tell us all about it. And his work has appeared in publications including The Guardian, New Humanist, Prospect, Haaretz, The Forward, New Statesman, you name it. Keith's been in all of them. And also we have Shaista Chishty, who is a documentary photographer and visual artist interested in the relationship between visual histories and the present, particularly in relation to the misrepresentation of Muslims in Britain. And Shaista is currently undertaking a PhD, a practice-based PhD at Cardiff University, and is a recipient of the prestigious Jameel Scholarship. So a very, very distinguished panel that we've got for you this evening to discuss. And also we want your comments and contributions and questions too. But that is our panel. And just kick us off briefly, very briefly, a line from each of you. Rob, why does this matter?
I think this matters because people can be genuinely hurt by clumsy editorial decisions around the placement of images that are taken legally and often in good faith.
Yeah, just echoing what Rob just said, I think there's real world consequences to harmful representations. And I think that in a visually saturated world where we consume so many images very passively, we need to start actively thinking about the impact that we have in the images that we're using, what we're putting out there.
Keith, give us, I suppose you could say, a formal opening or a presentation that really sums up why you think it's important and also showcases some of the research that you've been doing.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I suppose my 1 sentence elevator pitch is this is worth thinking about because too often hundreds of thousands or even millions of people are reduced to the image of 1 or 2 people. So I'm going to share a short presentation that will hopefully illustrate some of the themes. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So a few years ago, I started noticing something in the British media. The amount of coverage of Jews, anti-Semitism and Jewish issues has expanded dramatically in the last few years, partly due to the anti-Semitism controversy within the Labour Party. And I started noticing that a particular kind of image would often accompany stories in the British media about Jews. And these were pictures of strictly Orthodox Jews, known as Charedi Jews, men in groups of 1 or 2, taken from the back. And this was at first quite amusing to me. So I started sharing them online, and my Jewish connections used to send me them, and it became kind of a collection. And I collated them in this Tumblr, which is still there, but I don't update it, called All Jews Wear Black Hats and Have Beards, which is obviously sarcastic. I wasn't making the point that this was necessarily anti-Semitic or anything like that, but certainly it was something that was worth pointing out, and would get actually quite frustrating for myself and for other Jews that I know, including Jews that did have black hats and wear beards, because they didn't always want to be the stereotypical Jew. Eventually, I started noticing something else, which was that not only were pictures of Jews in black hats and beards taken from the back dominant, but one particular photo was dominant. It was this photo here of 2 Haredi men walking down the street with their backs to us. And that has been used. I did a Google reverse image search on this, and it has been used literally hundreds of times, including, shamefully, in the Jewish press to some extent. And this just kept appearing again and again and again. And I thought, well, what is this picture? Where did it come from? And why has it been so overused? It was quite easy to find out. I basically right-clicked and I saw that it was captioned, photograph Rob Stothard for Getty Images. Now, it made sense, of course. This was a stock image, and Getty Images is one of the main stock image sites. But who was Rob Stothard, and what did he think about this? Well, Rob and I got in touch, and I found out that not only had he noticed that his picture was being used repeatedly, he was also somewhat irked by it. Although I did point out to him that in and of itself, I think it's actually a great photo. And Rob helped me understand the circumstances in which this picture was taken. It was part of this set that you can find on Getty Images. And this was, Rob could tell the full story. He was sent out by Getty Images to illustrate a story after the Paris and Copenhagen attacks, a story that British police were stepping up patrols in areas with visible Jewish populations, such as Stamford Hill. And so he was sent to Stamford Hill to take a photo set about it. But what was interesting about it is that only certain pictures from Getty Images from this photo set ended up appearing very much in the British media. The ones with the faces tend not to be used at all. So I'm not aware that this picture that you're looking at now has ever actually been used. And Rob also told me something else that I found fascinating, which was that the famous image of the two men actually was accompanied by a picture of them from the front. And this is what they look like in the same thing. And to my knowledge, and it's been a while since I last did a Google reverse image search, to my knowledge, this has never been used, which I think is quite revealing and quite interesting. And it's quite worth thinking about what's the power of this picture of Jews taken from behind. I think it partly, I think it stems from several pre-existing ideas that are often not really reflected on. One is that these kinds of Jews are the prototypical Jew. The other is that this is a group that this particular kind of Jew is fairly secretive, fairly mysterious, keeps itself to itself, which isn't completely wrong. But there's this weird mixture of consideration and lack of care. On the one hand, it's saying, well, we don't want to expose people too much by using an image of people taken from the front. But on the other hand, it's falling on all sorts of assumptions about the secretiveness, of, at least of this particular kind of Jew, and sometimes by extension, other kinds of Jews. And the other thing that I thought was important to point out about these is that sometimes such images are used to illustrate stories that could not apply to this kind of Jew. So one of the most famous examples of that was that the Times illustrated a story a few years ago about anti-Semitism in the Oxford University Labour Club with a picture of Haredi Jews, not Rob's picture, but a similar one from a stock image site. And Haredi Jews, one thing that is central to them is virtually none of them go to university. Indeed, going to university is, for the majority of Jews like this, is something of a taboo. So it was clearly not appropriate to use it in this way. So Rob and I decided to work together to produce a different set of images of Jews. I've been writing and thinking about the diversity within British Jewry for many years now. And certainly as an educator, I think that the diversity of British Jewry isn't fully recognized, or if it is recognized, it's recognized very, very partially. So we wanted to see if we could suggest images that put into question what does a Jew look like, and suggested some answers, not definitive ones, but some answers. And our book came out earlier this year. Rob and I collaborated, I think, very successfully. I'm always someone who believes in trusting the professionals, so I was the one who selected the people for Rob to photograph, and then I left it, except in a few cases, I left it to Rob to work with the people involved to create a portrait that said something about who people were as Jews. So in a way, this was like the opposite of a stock photo site. These are some of the images that we have used. If you want to look at it in more detail, there's some of the pictures are in a Guardian photo set, and of course you could also find the book, which is available from the places that people usually buy books. But I just want to point out something, is that the book is not just a set of portraits. The portraits are accompanied by, this is basically how the book works. On the right hand side is a portrait, on the left hand side is a text either written by the subject or derived from an interview with me. And I think one of the most important things about that is we are proudly giving a lot of detail here. We're creating rich contextual information, which makes it very, very difficult to generalize from anybody in the book. It's like as I say, it's like the opposite of a stock photograph. However, one really fascinating thing is that this particular picture, which is of a woman called Tilla Crown, who's an artist, everybody who looks at the book picks up on this picture, which is, I would say, a fantastic picture. Tilla is an artist, but she's also Orthodox Jewish. She's wearing head covering there, although it isn't immediately visible, and there is a 9-branch Hanukkah in the background. It's just a fantastic picture, but it's had unintended consequences. Tilla and her husband create a kind of Jewish insider fanzine called Private Oi. And Tilla noticed something, and this is on the right is one of the pages of the latest Private Oi. It says, "Overused image finally replaced. A new book showcases portraits of a diverse range of modern British Jews, unlike its press coverage." And so the press coverage that it's had for the book, whether that's interviews with me or articles I've written, we've got about 10 photos that are cleared for reuse. for publicity purposes, and I send my Dropbox and here's 10 photos, you can use 4 or 5. And not only do they always choose this one, but they often choose this one as the main one. Now, this isn't a stop, you know, there is no license to reuse this. So this is never going to be like Rob's previous one. You're not going to see it hundreds and hundreds of times unless people use it illegally, of course, or without permission. But it does show that even when you create a book designed to make it hard to find a single image, certain images jump out at you for reasons other than stereotyping, because I don't think this is a stereotypical image, simply because this is a striking picture of a striking person. So that's taught me a lot about how some images appeal at least to editors as well as other people. Now, one of the things, I'm nearly finished, but one of the things we want to do in this session is think about what would good practice be. Now, our book is not good practice for the media. It doesn't really help. What it helps in is informing people about the diversity of jury and try to push people into thinking about this a little harder, particularly editors, particularly photo editors. But of course, we also understand that photo editors and editors live in the same world, in a high pressure world where every article nowadays is put online and has to include a photo, and people have limited resources and limited time. Well, we can't solve it completely, but here are a couple of ideas. The first is to think about the images that Jews themselves produce. And this is a project called Jiddische Kunst, or it's an archive of photos by a Charedi Jew called Dudi Brown, and it's held in the Wiener Library in central London. And it contains intimate portraits of the Charedi community from the inside. And it's really interesting to see the differences between these sorts of pictures and stock pictures, particularly since there's a joy in some of these pictures that you don't see in these pictures of mysterious people taken from the back. Another example is something called the Jewish Life Photo Bank. Now, that's based in Israel and is actually a challenge to the strictly Orthodox media, the Haredi media, which has now pretty much banned any images of women whatsoever. The Haredi population has kind of been radicalized. And even in Britain, Haredi newspapers generally won't show pictures of women. And so this is a photo bank of images of Orthodox Jewish women, again, taken from the inside. And there's, I showed you an example. Here, this is Jewish women praying together for the festival of Sukkot. It doesn't entirely solve the problem as well. I mean, there is an argument saying that stock photos are not a good idea, however they're done. And I also think they show a difficulty with insider images because they're often maybe a little bit too nice or a little bit too showing themselves in an unduly airbrushed way. Finally, I want to draw a comparison that I think might be helpful in thinking through these issues. And this is called what I call the Mansfield problem. So say you're an editor and at short notice you have to find an image to illustrate a story about Mansfield, either the town itself or someone there. You've got a problem because there is no stereotypical image of Mansfield unless you're from somewhere else in Nottinghamshire, maybe you know something about Mansfield, or perhaps if you're a fan of lower league football, so you know something about Mansfield Town. But most people, while they may have heard of Mansfield, don't have an image in their head. So that's the Mansfield problem. And it's interesting to note that if you look for stories about Mansfield, I found a couple here, news editors manage, photo editors manage. Either, as in the case on the right, they have a photo of one of the people interviewed in the article, or because, as on the left, they have a photograph of a place within Mansfield. So it is possible. So if we treated minorities as if they were Mansfield, perhaps we might be able to find some kind of progress on this issue. Okay.
That is brilliant. It's a great setup for the discussion today. Thank you so much for that. I will come back to you on some of those points, but just to make it clear, not to sound too facetious, but you're saying that a picture of Haredi Jews inspired you to write a book, and that book's images were singled out for one image, which kind of replaced the Haredi Jews because everybody wanted that image.
Well, it's more that I wouldn't go that far. I'd say that the image that replaced the Haredi Jews image was only in articles about this book. So, and
I'm
there's
joking
some
slightly, but I mean, it's a point, isn't it? We'll come back to this, whether actually, as you said, editors just use the most striking picture, as a challenge back. But we will return to this, and I'm sure there's going to be questions from our audience here as well. But let's move on to Rob Stothard. Your name was mentioned a lot there, Rob, because you actually took that picture as well. So just tell me about your combined research and also your own views on all of this and what you've come to understand from the work that you've been doing since then.
Firstly, it's going to comment on something Keith was saying about the fact that Tiller's image was used because it was striking. Part of the reason why the image of Tiller has been used quite a lot is because we were quite clear when we were promoting the book about the kinds of images that could be used to promote the book, because we worked so closely with the subjects to ensure that they were comfortable being involved in any kind of promotion for that. So that's a thing that I've been thinking about a lot, is about consent and collaboration and working with people when you are producing any kind of creative, editorial, educational, or journalistic project. I think that involvement with people that you're supposedly working with, and that clarity is really important. But to go back to the kind of the root of this conversation, if you haven't already realized, I did take that, I call it that fateful photograph that Keith was talking about earlier, of the two men walking down the street. And when Keith first started this campaign of questioning the use of my image, I believe he described it as coyly taken from behind, which is something I read recently. And Keith, I haven't actually had a chance to talk about what he maybe meant by referring to it as coyly, but based on our discussions that we've had about the situation surrounding the taking of that photograph, I assume that there's some belief that this image was made originally. The thought was that this image was made in isolation, perhaps without permission, and perhaps even without much purpose. Perhaps there's this feeling that I just snapped it as I was out and about, quite lucky to come across this moment, and subsequently sold it to a picture agency. There are lots of people who do work speculatively, and there are also lots of members of the public that believe that that is generally how most stock images are made. But in fact, and as Keith showed with the selection of images that are available, for an editor to use this image was actually quite a choice. And for hundreds of editors to have picked this image is also for use is actually quite a feat, really. The photograph was made on assignment for Getty Images on what I would have called a news shift, which is a bread and butter assignment for a photographer. The kind of assignment that somebody would take as in a day in, day out job that pay the bills. And essentially, as a photographer working for an agency, you're given an assignment in a similar way to a news photographer. The picture editor will brief you and send you out for the day. But what set Getty apart for me, and why I originally enjoyed working with Getty, was that their model of being a subscription service to a broad range of outlets meant that you could avail from producing extended kind of picture stories or photo essays, meaning that I could spend time shooting around stories a little bit rather than focusing on requiring let's say a single shot, which is often a preconceived image that photographers know will satisfy the demands or tastes of a particular editor at a particular publication. So as shown before, that the assignment was titled British police to step up patrols in Jewish communities, which for me was, reflecting back to that time, it was quite a nice assignment. I got to go by myself without the press pack to a part of London I don't know very well and explore. And whilst I didn't anticipate being particularly welcome walking around with a camera, not because I perceived community to be hostile in any way, it's more that it's not so easy to be a fly on the wall. And I'd started to become less, let's say, less comfortable with trying to take photographs when I'm not really sure if I'm welcome or not. But ultimately, I was able to take the picture which illustrated the story. There were images in my edit that included members of the community alongside the police by themselves, but also ultimately the issue that arose came from my being able to photograph the area more generally, or images which maybe go outside of the brief to be accepted by my editors, because they are very, very pleased to add to the variety that is available to give to their clients, both on that day, but also down the line. And the issue, I think, arises where images which are taken in what I would say in good faith, in line with editorial guidance and filed directly for a story which has been which I've been commissioned to do, linger and become misused and misappropriated over time.
You talked about the difference with Tiller's photograph is the sense or the reality of consent. I'm just interested when you took those pictures on the street. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Keith may explain it better, but not all Charedi Jews like being photographed out in public. Did you have consent in that particular instance when you were photographing on the streets and with that community?
Well, I'll be facetious, suppose, and suggest that I don't have to
No,
get
I
permission.
realize that.
So I'll say that straight away, because I think that may be, for me, that's not how I like to work, but there are occasions where it happens and you use your privilege as somebody working in the press to be able to photograph in public spaces freely. And that comes down to the individual photographer as to how they feel about the legality and the ethics surrounding that. I personally like people to know that I'm around, and I will be as clear as I can about taking photographs, and will be as honest as I can be about how those pictures are going to be used. This honesty and clarity about how images are going to be used becomes very, very difficult when you're working for an agency that you know is selling to almost every publication that can afford it. How clear can you be with somebody in that situation? And how much do you tell them? How much don't you tell them? And it becomes quite a dilemma for the person in that situation. The main faux pas with me working in that community in Stafford Hill on that day was that actually I was working on a Saturday, and Keith might want to say this himself, but described is something you can't really understate how important Shabbat is.
Yeah.
And whilst I shared the occasional smile with people as they were walking down the street, whilst I was quite obviously taking a photograph, that says a lot more about them than it does about me and my profession. I wonder if Keith would maybe elaborate on that.
It has two consequences very quickly. One is all the pictures in that photo set are people wearing it's not Sunday best, Saturday best.
Yeah.
So they probably look smarter, which might be how they want to be portrayed. The second thing is there's a striking difference between doing this in Stamford Hill and if you were to do it in Israel, where there are over 1 million Haredim, where neighborhoods completely close off during the Sabbath, and where people who use electronic equipment or drive in or anything like that will be faced, possibly even to the point of violence. So it shows the radical difference between the same type of Jew, but in two different locations.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I should say, of course, that we know that legally you can photograph and film in the street, but it was just an interesting point. And the police often misunderstand that, but it's an interesting point about consent. Shaista, let me bring you in, because as I said at the beginning, you're a prize-winning photographer, an artist, and a journalist. And you're also a Muslim woman and have your own views on the representation, particularly of Muslims in the media. Do you want to say something about that?
I mean, I'd start off by saying that a lot of what Keith and Rob have both said resonate in so many different ways. I think that the key thread here is an oversimplification, really. I think that the work that we ask images to do, it's just too much. The thought that a photo editor can sit and in one image represent nuance, complexity, which exists in the world. And from a Muslim perspective, I mean, you know, there's something like just under 2 billion Muslims in the world, which come in all shapes, forms, sizes, and of religiosity or not. All of that nuance gets lost when in a busy newsroom, somebody wants to animate a story and put an image which essentially tells the whole story. It's impossible. So it's oversimplification in the first point. Our brains are consuming images at such a fast pace. We actually process them in quicker than actually the written word. And we do it in a passive way because of the over saturation of images around us. So when you see the same kind of trope over and over again, the simplified idea of what a Muslim looks like, or what a Jewish person, or whatever anybody else looks like, when you see that over and over again, the image bank in the unconscious mind is clocking that and registering and essentially, essentializing a whole group of peoples, which is what's problematic. And I think that the other element to this is our obsession with aesthetics, with getting that beautiful image. And I think that's also part of the problem here. I really liked what you talked about, the Mansfield problem. I think that if we treated everything like the Mansfield problem, things would be a lot simpler. And I think that, I know we're going to talk later about image libraries, but that they, in my opinion, are part of the problem, because what you do is, in this busy world, when you're in a newsroom and you've got a story that needs to go out, oh, it's a story about Muslims, right? Type in Muslim or Muslim woman. What comes up is a very narrow, reductive idea of what a Muslim woman looks like, for example, in that scenario. And actually, in my opinion, it actually is rooted in the beginnings of photography back in the mid 1800s, when photography first became, and it was part of the colonial project of categorizing and classifying people. What we're seeing today in image libraries, when we type in a classification of a this or a that, it's kind of rooted in that kind of practice, our obsession with knowing people by categorizing them. And I don't say that lightly, because as we touched earlier, there are real life consequences when we do that. Now, I know that, Keith, I mentioned earlier to you that I had a similar scenario as you were seeing that one image over and over again. I actually saw an image of a niqab, a face-veiled Muslim woman, shown over and over and over again. And I don't know if, Joe, you're around and you have the slides, but I just wondered if it might be interesting to have a look at my deep dive on that one image. This is the image that I kept seeing over and over again. And I decided, when we were planning to have this session today, I thought, oh, it's really interesting that you had a similar scenario with this one image that you kept seeing everywhere, and it just annoyed you that it was just being used to represent a whole community. And obviously with face-veiled Muslim women, it's an extreme example in the sense that, you know, it's actually such a minority within a minority, but it's an image that's overrepresented in our media space. And you never see you never have a named woman who's doing anything. It's always a very passive, static, recycled stock image like this one. So if we move to the next slide, what I decided to do was to do, similar to you, Keith, a Google reverse image search.
Wow.
And I decided, right, let me see how many news articles are illustrated with this one image, which now stands in for anything to do with face veiling or just Muslim women in general. And if you go to the next, I mean, these are results that I'm showing you here. And if you go again to the next slide, you can see more and more. And I'm not going to show you more because it bloody went on forever. And it's
Wow.
like 18, 19 pages worth of hits of this one image illustrating news articles. And I think that demonstrates the harm, actually, that the idea of the single image available on a stock image site library, the harm that can do, because subliminally so many people have now consumed that, and now whatever it is in those articles, because the articles about anything and everything to do with Muslims, you know, they will now combine unconsciously those subjects with this woman. And you know, coming back to the idea of consent, consent's a really interesting one, because even going back to Rob's image, had Rob got consent from the two individuals in that photograph, that consent only is as good as that one usage, because on an image library, anyone, I mean, I could go on, any of us in this room could go on and purchase that for use anywhere and everywhere. I mean, I don't know what the small print is, but the usage rights are pretty, you know, you can buy images and use them as you please. So that consent only is really valid for when the individuals know what it's being used for. And if it's being used in multiple contexts, well, then you need to get consent over and over again. And again, this is why image libraries can be problematic.
Shaista, which sorry to interrupt, what image library was that?
This one.
Yeah.
I actually did I was going to do a reverse image search, but Google Lens has a new thing where this algorithm uses the data from an area that you select. So I selected the face because articles have used this either close up or further out, because as I've seen from the Google Lens search, the algorithm search. And you can do that obviously with any image that you find. So, for example, with images to do with Muslims, again, coming back to the reductive nature, people will want to see what they think a Muslim, what they already know a Muslim in their mind looks like. So they'll want to see some sort of symbol. I mean, for example, you'd never see somebody that looks like me in an image library and tagged Muslim woman, because they're looking for very reductive, shorthand, simplified ideas. So you'll see a hijab, you'll see a man with a beard, you'll see some sort of symbol, and I imagine it's the same if you're looking for, you know, to illustrate an article to do with a Jewish community here or a Jewish community there. So yeah,
I think the difference, Shaista, though, is I can't really see the stories very closely. I'm imagining nearly every single one of those stories is a negative story.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's not to say that they're not negative stories about Haredi Jews or any Jew, Keith, but at least there was a variety, you know, which is a very simplistic thing to say.
But there's also a major difference as well with how the intersectionality of this, with how Jews signify. Now, I think Rob was aware, and I think there is there are two differences between your image, Shaista, and Rob's image. One is it's taken from the front, and the other is it's of a woman. There's a kind of collusion when this is where it gets really complicated. In the Haredi world, there's been a removal of images of women in the Haredi media, to the point that there was, in the famous picture of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton watching the assassination of Osama bin Laden, in some of the Haredi media, Hillary Clinton was airbrushed out. But there also seems to be an awareness generally that photographing image of Jewish Orthodox women is potentially problematic. So the two things collude in ways that are very, very difficult to get your head around. But I don't think that the image, there is that pictures of Orthodox Jewish women aren't coded with the same kind of exoticism, post-colonial exoticism that an image of a woman in a niqab has. And and also there seems to be less worry about exposing a woman in that respect than there might be in terms of Jews. Now, obviously, this varies by country and it varies by context, but I think these are quite significant differences, neither of which shows anybody up in a particularly good light. But it's revealing of wider sense of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in these contexts.
Let's bring in some of our audience because they've been sitting very patiently. Fascinating discussion so far, it really is. And I'm sure a lot of it is new to people. Didn't even realize. I didn't realize a lot of this.
I've got a question. If you're working for a very small charity and there's not much money and you can't afford a fee to Getty or anyone for images and you rely on stock images, is there a gap in the market, do you think, for perhaps religious organisations to offer images for charitable use, free?
I wonder whether, as we saw in the Jewish Life Photo Bank, I wonder whether the care that some of those religious organisations would take might be that the images aren't seen as exciting enough. That I'm not saying it's not an idea that should be done, but I worry that they might seem a little bit like propaganda photos, like socialist realism or something. That's my only concern with that. I think that the other thing that I showed, which is not stock images, but it portraits from the inside, because they show life in a bit more of an unbridled way, I think perhaps would work better. I should say that I have found there is a Flickr stream of Hasidic Jews in Stamford Hill, and I think those are reusable, but it's unclear who's taking them.
I don't think that I necessarily think there's a solution in terms of creating stock, but one thing I was going to mention a little later that I can mention now is that I think if you work with photographers or illustrators who are from certain communities, you can potentially remedy quite a few of the issues we've spoken about. So by working with people from communities, you are less likely to end up creating images which maybe end up being kind of visual tropes. But you also maybe build a community of people who are more willing to work with you as an organization. And I know one very good organization called Women Photograph that has a database of photographers, female photographers all over the world, tapping into local and kind of specific illustrators and artists might be a good way to, as I said, maybe remedy some of the issues we've been talking about.
But we'll have a look at some of the photo agencies in a minute, because they are used all the time by media outlets. Shaista, has anybody ever actually complained to you? I'm just interested, saying, because you're in that world and you're a photographer and you're an artist, has anybody ever said to you, have you seen how they're portraying Muslims? Is it something that's the talk of people who are very offended by these images?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Muslims that I speak with are constantly annoyed about misrepresentations in the media. And there's been so much research that's been done in this space, but it's predominantly been around the discourse. And there has been work done on studying the kind of images, but it has been less so. And I think that that's something that in this, as I keep saying, visually saturated world, we'll need to do more analysis of, because from my perspective, I am a lot more conscious now. So every morning when I scroll my news feed, I'm looking at the images that are being used, and I am constantly appalled, constantly annoyed myself for all different types of communities at the very reductive kinds of images that are being used. It's not just problematic images about Muslims that are out there. There are other communities that are also being misrepresented. And I think that for me, coming also back to your question, Ruth, as well, it's about getting creative and having a longer view. It's about doing the work to educate yourself and to understand. So for example, everybody in this room could set themselves the task of every time I'm going to be scrolling through the news, I'm going to make a conscious decision to step back and think, okay, what is this image with this article? Why has this been used and what is it telling me? And to be really switched on about the images that we are consuming, to try to draw trends. And this stands for everybody. But in terms of photo editors, there needs to be a longer term plan in terms of coalition building to try to educate and learn. Because I will put my hand up and say that as a Muslim woman who has always been Muslim, I, as a photojournalist, also misrepresented Muslims and other groups of individuals when I was flying around and, parachuted in and out, taking reductive tropes. I've done it all. And that's why I'm quite conscious of it now. And so there's so many images that are out there, but that I've actually created that are being used and actually misused as well. And as we know, in this internet age, once an image is out there, it's out there. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there needs to be this longer term plan, and we need to step outside of this. Oh, I need an image right now, and I'm just going to have to. I think if you're in that scenario, then whatever your gut is telling you to do in that moment, do the opposite. So Ruth, in that moment, if there's a charity organization that needs an image to illustrate something, think outside the box, go with an illustration, go with something abstract. Don't feed the issues of continually making dehumanizing people, because even if a religious organization, you were saying about maybe religious groups should get together and have their own. Firstly, as Keith said, you will potentially end up with creating that, for example, in a Muslim sense, the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy will come into play, where you'll want to represent in a good light, but actually you just want humanizing images. So if you need to illustrate an article, maybe go to the stock image library and just type in human. If you're looking for humans of any kind, just type in human. I mean, I've never tried that with the stock image library. I don't know what will come up, actually. That would be an interesting experiment. Just don't type in Muslim or Muslim woman, because actually, going back to the slide deck, I don't know if it's worth quickly bringing that up again, because I typed in a popular image library Muslim, and what came up, lo and behold, all the annoying tropes. And then I also obviously did a Google image search, and again the same annoying tropes are there, like I said, reductive, bringing in the symbols, and they just reinforce all the negative stereotypes that are there. I think from my perspective, we need to move away from this idea of knowing what this person or that person looks like, just.
This is really insightful, Shaista. And also, I must say, we've got some questions which I'm going to go to, but having worked in newsrooms for nearly 40 years, I can say that journalists always tell you they're in a hurry and they're working on breaking news. Do you know what? When I've done analysis, the vast majority of stories are pre-planned. Okay, the pre-planned. A very small percentage is actually breaking news. You have the time. You do have the time to research things properly. We've got some really interesting questions. I'll come to you, Trevor, in a moment. But for you, Keith, if people can see that in the chat, do you know why in the case you made at the beginning, the Jewish men were mostly photographed from the back? Do you think it was due to a lack of consent of the men being photographed? Or do you think it has another reason that media prefers to show, I presume, Jews in this instance from behind?
So to answer that, you have to ask two sorts of people. You have to ask Rob as somebody, but Rob didn't take all those pictures from the back, but he did take quite a lot. And but the question it's slightly different is, why is it whether there are pictures taken from the front, do you choose an image of people taken from the back? And I'd be interested to see what Rob thinks about that. But I just did a couple of searches just now on Getty Images. There are a lot of pictures of Jewish men and Jewish women taken from the front. And there are alternatives there. So the question is, that's why these things are so meaningful, is not the images that are provided, it's the images that are used. So I guess I would say, Rob, did you make sure during that session that you were taking some from the back because you thought maybe that would be a better way of doing it, or would you just always work like that?
No, I haven't spent a career shooting pictures of people from behind. I think it's you get both if you're waiting for people to walk past you, and I think you think, well, I try to give a variety. I'm trying to satisfy my editors, and if you look at the edit as we did before, you'll see that there's a balance of the pictures of people's faces with expressions who are identifiable, who have emotion. But I think the issue comes that is all quite interpretable and doesn't have longevity. And what we're seeing in terms of this misuse and this overuse is pictures which are not necessarily illustrating the article in context or in a timely manner. So by using pictures that are shot from behind you, you take away a lot of what can be loaded onto that picture. You also reduce the likelihood that someone's going to complain, perhaps, as well. I think there are lots of good reasons for an editor to pick an image that's been shot from behind. I think your question of the way that mystifies and some slightly more, I think, sinister ideas that you think about the use of those kinds of images are interesting. But I do think that the reason it's used so much is because it is less likely to draw any obvious conclusions. Whilst, like Shaista's saying, the press seems quite obsessed with having pictures of people, and one which is a little bit more anonymous works in their favor.
I think, speaking of somebody who's been an editor, it's your point really that you don't want a complaint, and actually it's sometimes easier to be anonymous and show from behind. But that's not saying that there might be ulterior motives for some people. Trevor, let me bring you in because you've got a question as well.
Well, I was just wondering whether, the nature of the problem is part of the medium itself. The old cliche, the camera never lies. Well, the camera always lies, or a lot of the time does. And, my medium's a microphone, not a camera. But as soon as you put a camera in, the camera distorts, but it purports to record. And the problem there with consent is if you say, can I take a picture? There'll be a completely different picture than if you don't ask for the consent. So I suppose my question to Keith, Shaista, and Robert is, what goes through your head when you press the shutter?
Yeah, well, I always used to pride myself on, it's all instinct. You just know an image, you just know when it's happening in front of you, you've just got to hit that shutter. But now I'm older and wise, well, hopefully wiser. I would say that it's the visual socialization that teaches you what a good image looks like. So as when I was a younger photographer, I had internalized what a good image looks like based on the National Geographics and all the big names, Magnum photographers. But now I look at those images completely differently. I find them really problematic and harmful. And it's kind of why I did a kind of a shuffle out of working as a photojournalist, because I just didn't want to contribute, because photo editors want a certain type of image. And if a photographer is not going to provide it, they just won't commission them. So it's just not a sustainable career. So I understand why people end up falling into that. And that's another part of the problem, is the lack of investment. The lack of investment in shooting complex stories in the first place, but also, photographers and their time, they're not being paid in the same way. So of course, they're going to hurry from job to job for survival. So it's a very complex story, actually, overall. But I used to think it was instinct, coming back to your question. And I think now I think, and even if I shoot the shot that I think that I want, before I unleash it into the world, I will think about it from different perspectives. And it's as much about what's not in the image as what is in the image itself.
That once you've taken, I mean, the picture of the woman in the niqab is a superb photograph. Ditto Rob's picture of the Haredi Jews. Use it in a different context, put it with a different headline, put it in a different publication, and it means something different, doesn't it?
But of course, the image can mean an infinite number of things. We all come into both producing images and reading images with our own understanding based on our backgrounds, and that's what goes through my head a lot more now when I do take pictures. I also moved away from working in photojournalism. I don't work for news agencies anymore, and I almost said to myself, I'd never take a portrait again. But I think the key thing for me is that you can create good images if you work with people. And I suppose if your question about what goes through your head when you're pressing the shutter, that it's a combination of aesthetics and a feeling that you are representing somebody in a way that is true to them, and that they feel like they've been a part of that. And once you expose yourself to this, I think it could be a much more enjoyable world.
Rob,
But
just while
like
you're on, there's a question from Dave Francis. I mean, you've just said you don't work for photo agencies, news agencies anymore, but would you shoot that set of pictures, the ones you took of those Haredi Jews, would you shoot them differently now to illustrate the same story?
If I was being really bold, I would probably suggest, if it's the exact same story, I think that there are images that already exist that could illustrate it reasonably well. If what I would maybe say to editors is, do you really want to create a breaking news story about this issue? This issue runs much deeper than this story which you want to get out into the Sunday papers. Why don't you speak to somebody who is an expert? Let's say Keith, for example, speak to an expert on this issue and produce something maybe with a photographer who gets access to people who've been affected by this issue, maybe creates portraits if that's what people consent to, produce a variety of images that show spaces, landscapes, details, and people, that gives much broader insight to a story than a kind of flash in the pan article that gets lost in the Sunday papers and is online for a day. And the images that are produced to create a story which is very short-lived end up outliving that and causing more damage.
Can I just at this point jump in and say that whilst I didn't, as I said, I didn't attend most of the photo sessions for the book with Rob. I did attend some, and it was fascinating to me as a non-photographer I've occasionally had a portrait taken for me for the media, and of course I got married and I had wedding pictures taken, but really this is not a world that I know. And what I found brilliant about Rob's approach was that he was a total straight arrow. He didn't come into those sessions with, as far as I could see, with any kind of agenda whatsoever. And he didn't talk a lot to people other than to giving words of encouragement and stuff like that. And that gave people the space to be who they wanted to be. And particularly, there was one of the ones I accompanied Rob to was I wanted a picture of a Jewish prisoner in the book. And we were there for several hours, and this was it was quite a shy and diffident guy. And I saw that what Rob was doing was not treating him as a generic Jew for an image in a book about generic Jews, but as a person who was interested in this person's life and working with him to produce something that everyone could be proud of. That's one of the reasons why I didn't do this book with a Jewish photographer, right? I think sometimes it's important to have photographers who don't have a strong stake in it, provided that they're aware of whatever inbuilt biases they might have. It's sometimes the idea of I am a camera, right, which was always ironic. It can be something to aspire to, I think.
I don't think it would have worked quite so well without having you, Keith, as a collaborator in that scenario.
No, I was the one who was the guarantor to the people there that I was legit, as well as knowing who needed to be in the book in the first place.
I wouldn't therefore suggest that sending ignorant photographers out to photograph people is going to create good pictures.
No, I'm not saying you were ignorant. You weren't. You were briefed by me. That was the point.
Right. So it
briefed by me,
requires
but
a collaboration.
Yeah, but the session itself was about two people, you and the portraitee.
I don't think that people necessarily consciously go in and photograph in a way that's reductive or problematic. I think it's the conditioning. I think it's seeing the same kind of images over and over. And I would kind of challenge you a bit on that, Keith. I think that a Jewish photographer could have done just as well in that scenario, because I think that then takes us down a slightly, only, the neutral white pale male style can be, the objective voice. So I will challenge you on that. But the portraits are beautiful, and I really would echo what Rob has just said about investing in more meaningful work, collaboration with photographers. And, some publications do that, and more often for the weekend magazines. But then again, I would also say that you're only as good as the team that's doing the commissioning. And some departments are commissioning the same old. So your end product will also still be potentially problematic. But if we are, commissioning diverse voices of all different types of photographers, different backgrounds, insiders, outsiders, whatever you want to call them, a mixed bag, then you can start to get some of that nuance. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely an advocate of slower photography.
In a way, to be slightly provocative, and everything you've said is absolutely true, but just to be slightly in the defense of busy newsrooms and journalists, and I'm not saying this is right, but I spoke to an editor earlier today who said, do you know what, when you're under pressure, it's not that there's skullduggerous things going on, or they want necessarily, apart from what we saw from you, Shaista, and there's pictures of the niqab, but sometimes you just need a picture. You just need one. And I'm not saying it's much of a defense, but that does happen, doesn't it? And then they rely on stock images.
Maybe that attitude has become the norm, and maybe that's the issue.
It's not the exception, it's the norm. Is that what you say?
Perhaps.
Creative with your search terms when you're using stock images. So you don't have to type in the same search term that's going to yield the same old, just a bit more creativity.
Now, I know you both hate, or all three of you hate news agencies. Let's just flash up the most used ones. But this is what we're using mostly, isn't it? In most newsrooms, you come in. I work mostly for the BBC. Is it Elvis Ruth that was the picture generator? I can't even remember now. Rather strange name.
Can you see it? I've just shared
there
my
you go.
screen. Can you see
there
it?
you go.
Yeah.
So are any of those, all three of you, are any of those, do they have redeeming features, or are they all beyond the pale and slightly evil? Not evil, that was a joke, by the way, don't sue us.
I mean, I don't know them very well. I had a very quick look. I mean, I'm going to say that they don't have the same... I wouldn't say that they're amazing, no. But I also think there's like I alluded earlier to, complexity. There's the additional element of free stock image libraries also kills photography as an industry. Yeah. And that's another thing that's also the elephant in this room. So
I do agree. I think budgets are a huge issue, and they have been maybe post.
Some of these are not cheap, though, are they? I mean, you have to pay a license. You have to pay for these things.
I think the point that these are free.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
So the big players would be your Getty Images, and then
they are very expensive.
Agence France Presses, and yes, the subscription fees are
these
very,
are
very
ones,
high.
Aren't they? Sorry. Well, now we've had a look at them, and now we're seething. I'm interested also, Shaista and Rob, that, I mean, you've suggested that you've, in a sense, turned a corner. I mean, I went onto your website today, Shaista, and you've got some amazing pictures on there, incredibly beautiful portraits. We've seen a lot of Rob's work, so that's why I'm saying this to you now. Are you saying that you wouldn't take pictures in that same way again? Is that what you said earlier?
Well, firstly, shame on me for not taking my website down, because I find all of that work problematic now.
All of it?
Yes, majority of it.
I was going to publicize it, but you wouldn't want me to.
Yeah, no, it's no, but
we're
it's
all
good.
going to look at it now while we still can.
But I put my hand up, and I think this is how we learn. I never intended to go out and make problematic pictures, and I thought I was working ethically at the time. And yes, aesthetically, they tick the box, and that's probably why they were used. But we need to, well, that's what I'm actually interested in, is that I think aesthetically pleasing things are often in this context problematic and can be reductive. And I think that something happens in our brains when we see beautiful things, and it kind of makes us accept something that perhaps, or not challenge something that perhaps we should. So the majority of things on my website are images taken with working with different NGOs and photographing in different parts of the world, very much photographer in and out, not spending long enough. I thought I was working ethically. I would always spend time talking to people, but that's not really enough. Images don't exist in a vacuum. So if it was just those images that existed in the world, the ones on my website, it would be fine. But they contribute to a problematic story, which I believe people's, and that's why I find them problematic now.
Well, I mean, I would urge you to add context so that they stay there, because they are amazing photographs. I'm not just saying it because you sat there. They are truly amazing photographs. But I understand what you're saying. Robin, you've said that you don't want to work for news agencies anymore. You don't want to work in that news beat. Do you want to say something a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think I do research and work on stories which I think do lend themselves to being published editorially. I think the key thing for me is having a sense of control over the dissemination of images. I think images, when combined with text and when produced in collaboration with a variety of people, from academics through to people with lived experiences of issues and politicians, can be a really, really powerful journalistic and therefore educational tool. For me, it's about making sure that when you put an image out there, that it's being viewed in the context under which it was produced, and being clear and honest with yourself about why you're using that image and how it benefits that story, and making sure that you're comfortable with the people in it, if there are people in it. I'm going through a process of looking back at old work that I took when I was working as a photojournalist and on assignments for publications like The Times or working for Getty, and looking at the images that I maybe shot for myself that I didn't submit to the archive, and trying to think, well, what was I thinking then? Why didn't I send that image to the agency? Why did I keep that for myself? What was it that I was thinking then? And there was definitely the sense that, okay, the editors want to see this. I'm more interested in this. They're not interested in the conflict. They're interested in the issue that affects British citizens, for example. And it's quite an interesting process to go through. One assignment, for example, I did shot for Getty Images was the downing of the Malaysian air flight in eastern Ukraine. And while shooting for Getty on my digital cameras, I had my own film camera with me. And the editors would be horrified to know that half the time I was shooting things for myself, because I was quite disillusioned with the assignment I'd been sent on. When I was surrounded by this war that we know is going on now, I was sent to focus on one story, which was very much focusing on the effect it had on British people. So yeah, I have little interest in putting images out into the world that can be decontextualized.
Okay. I missed.
You didn't do one with a teddy bear next to a piece of wreckage or something, did you? Rob?
Drop the
Of
dead
course I
donkey.
did.
That was probably what they wanted.
Yeah, and I did, and I would have shot that and filed it. You know what they're looking for, and it's a prestigious agency to work for, and I was very pleased to have been sent on assignment. So it's a challenging thing to balance. I must say that working for newspapers can be quite a different story. So it's not to try to lump every kind of news outlet and the related parties into the same box. There's great work that's happening, great photographers and great editors out there. But there's a lot of work to be done, which we've spoken about quite a bit.
Okay, Rob, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the example that I just shared a little while ago with that one image of the niqab wearing woman in the rain, that was used across the whole spread, left, right wing, everything. It's been used everywhere. I think that there's certain publications where you're more likely to see like screaming angry Muslim men with like daggers or whatever with a very sensational headline. You're more likely to see that obviously in certain publications. But, you know, a lot of these publications are working with the same stock image libraries, and, you know, they're sourcing the images from the same kind of places. So yeah, you'll see the whole spread using the same image.
What about you, Rob? What's your view on this?
Yeah, it happens all the time. I was researching just before this talk about looking for examples of some good practice, and I came across pictures that were illustrating some violent unrest that was occurring in Leicester earlier this year. And I looked at the range of different publications to see the kind of images that were produced. And there's one Muslim-focused online publication that I follow, that the image they used, I thought was the most appropriate picture to use of that very complicated and difficult situation, because it didn't identify any individuals, and it didn't have any kind of semiotics that would be linked to a Muslim community or a Hindu community, whereas other publications, even the Independent, which I would say would be one of the more left-leaning publications in the country, had used an image in which there was a mural on a wall which suggested that the area was a Hindu area, despite it being a broader issue that was affecting multiple communities. So left-leaning, right-leaning or not, there is lack of understanding and maybe lack of pause for thought and consideration.
I've just been looking while we've been saying this. I've been looking at the Morning Star website and looking just at the pictures, and I'm thinking, if I didn't know it was the Morning Star, like far left paper, would I be able to tell? And the answer to that is probably no, I wouldn't be able to tell. There's certainly no. There are lots of stories about asylum, and none of them are on the more offensive end. But on the other hand, I can imagine them being in the Mail as well.
We've seen very similar images when it comes to issues around migration, for example. The papers will all use very similar images. I think the point is the images are there as almost like they're illustration. They're not contributing to the journalism a lot of the time, and it's the stories that accompany them which are causing the damage.
I'm going to draw this fascinating discussion to a close now, and I'm going to come to each of you for a line, really, in terms of, well, where do we go now? And then just to throw into the mix again, I'm certainly not defending lazy journalists, and lazy was a word I used at the beginning, and I think that is true. But we know in this kind of morass of stuff that's across the internet, in particular where people read these stories, that the average time spent looking at a video, for example, is 8 seconds. 8 seconds. If you don't grab people, and images drive stories as well as video. I think that's partly what some journalists perhaps are thinking. We need striking images that will bring people into our story. But Shaista, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? What is your vision or hope for the future? And I'll come to each of you.
Yeah, well, the ideal scenario would be that that we're taught visual literacy. I think that one of the biggest problems is that images are everywhere, but we're not taught visual literacy, and photographers need to make sure that they're working responsibly and learning about photo histories. I talked about the old, the complicity of photography with the colonial project and classifying people. We need to make sure that as photographers, we're educating ourselves. I think that obviously I mentioned visual literacy, but I also think that we need to come together as collectives. And there's organizations such as, I made some notes, the Photo Ethics Center are really good. They have really good podcasts. I think that ethics and ethical literacy and visual literacy can come together. I think that if you are genuinely caring about creating change, if you are in a position of power where you're able to commission photographers or you work in a photo desk, then make sure you take the time to really learn and to unpick your own behaviors and to invest the time. There's other organizations that specifically deal with Muslim representation. The MCB has a strand called the Center for Media Monitoring, and they do a lot of work. So if you're in a newsroom and you genuinely care about how you're representing Muslims, they're brilliant for collaborating with. There's bloggers out there and practitioners who are doing a lot of talking. I know Doc Rabbit, Benjamin Chesterton is really vocal on Twitter, and he's really calling out a lot of the problematic practices of how images that are for sale are tagged, for example, in non-white children from non-Western countries are being visibly identifiable and hashtagged with rape, prostitute, all these problematic things. I mean, I'm bringing in massive new things, but what I'm saying is there's people out there who are actually campaigning. So if you really care, you will collaborate and work with and learn from the people who are actually doing the hard work in calling things out, and you will spend the time to learn.
Well, I think with this increasing use of stock images and also the kind of increasing rise of AI-produced images, if you consider the Google image search we looked at earlier, I think new photography work will be that which can't be preconceived to support any existing or fixed narrative. And I predict an increased interest in traditional photojournalism and documentary photography, which has been in quite serious decline in the last decade or more, albeit with a more contemporary understanding of the importance of working with and giving voice to communities, and giving Indigenous, local and socially aware photographers a greater platform.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say to Shaista, thank you so much for coming, because Shaista, you wouldn't know it, you really wouldn't know it, but Shaista's been really ill, and thanks for being a trooper. But the other thing, the main thing is I'm not a photographer, and though I do sometimes do journalism, I have a foot in other worlds too. And what I'd say is this process of working with Rob and before that investigating this picture taught me things that I didn't know before. And that's not a good thing. It shouldn't require me doing a specific project with a photographer to learn about this stuff. I'm not sure quite where it should be done or how it should be done, but it's taught me how my own visual literacy needed to be radically improved. And I think it has, but as I say, shouldn't have taken doing this project to do that.
Keith, thank you so much. And as a final thought, Shaista talked about visual literacy. The reason that the Religion Media Centre here is to promote religious literacy. I think the discussion today goes hand in glove with that thought. One of the things we find is that many journalists really don't have much understanding about minorities and faith groups, and that is the reason that we're here. So please, as I said at the beginning, if you've not done it already, please go to religionmediacentre.org.uk. We represent all faiths in terms of literacy. and we present an email every single day with a wide variety of stories. Please sign up for the email. We've got fact sheets. We have Zooms every week. We present a podcast every Friday as well. But for the moment, to Keith, to Rob, and to Shaista, thank you so much. And thank you, all of you, for staying with us and listening and joining in this debate. Thank you. Bye-bye.